The country is a powder keg. The election of Abraham Lincoln has finally ignited decades of tension between North and South. 7 states have already seceded before he was even in office, and now he had to physically get to his office. His train stops through Baltimore on its way to Washington, D.C. Yet Lincoln would never get there. He would be shot dead. Despite heightened security, it just wasn't enough. Abraham Lincoln himself is the first casualty of the Civil War. Yeah, so that was alternate history. Clearly. Like, even someone who doesn't know history knows that Lincoln was shot after the war, but there was a possibility that it could have been sooner. This was the Baltimore Plot. Now, theorizing about the Baltimore Plot is kind of complicated because there isn't a ton of information about any of the specifics. Really, all you need to know is that the railroad companies heard some rumors that something might go down when Lincoln went into town, and so they hired a private investigator, Alan Pinkerton, to check it out. No, that name is not a coincidence. The most Pinkerton and his agents could conclude was that something might happen, and a lot of people were certainly angry at Lincoln. They might even use weapons on him. Will they use a knife? Or a gun? A brick? All are possible. Why not? Pinkerton set up quite the elaborate spy operation. He even had one of his agents disguise herself as Miss Cherry, a southern dame with a fake accent. Apparently, they uncovered a few alleged plots, like one to sabotage the rail lines to make the train stop, or surround Lincoln's train cart while he was in station, and beat him to death. There wasn't that much concrete evidence, though. All they really had was that a lot of people really hated Lincoln in Baltimore, especially some guys at the Barnum Hotel. In the end, Lincoln's team just didn't want to take the chance. They still had to go past Baltimore, though. It was the only way into DC by train. So, instead of a daytime arrival like originally planned, they decided to smuggle Lincoln through at night. On the night of February 23rd, Lincoln's train arrived hours ahead of schedule. Disguised, poorly, in a soft hat and borrowed overcoat, he slipped through Baltimore unnoticed, while the would-be assassins remained none the wiser. The aftermath of this was both relief and ridicule. Newspapers mocked Lincoln for sneaking into Washington, kind of unaware of how real the threat had been. This was still during the nothing ever happened stage of the war. It wouldn't be until weeks later where a pro-Confederate mob would riot against Union troops in Baltimore, and, well, hindsight is 2020. So, what if we removed these Bond-level spies from the equation? What if the railway execs who hired them were too busy to actually hire them? Imagine if Lincoln's team had been as unprepared as Fort Sumter was, left vulnerable to a Confederate barrage. Everyone forgets about the naval aspect of the Civil War, which is kind of a shame because it was pretty cool. But you know who didn't forget about the Navy? World of Warships Legends, the sponsor of today's video. They have some ships that'll make the USS Monitor look like a pile of floating scrap. To celebrate the 4th of July, this summer's update brings in explosive new gameplay and festive camouflages. Welcoming back the Louisiana, a legendary tier battleship. She has 406mm guns, potent secondaries, and deadly torpedo airstrikes. Plus, she's the final reward in a brand new free bureau project. If you haven't yet heard about it, World of Warships Legends is a massive multiplayer free-to-play game on both consoles and mobile. Instead of other Twitch-based online multiplayers, use strategy and precision to defeat your opponents in PvP battles ranging from 9v9 to 3v3. Fight with destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and even aircraft carriers in a game that has seen 8 million players since its launch. With 400 plus ships, 20 plus maps, 100 plus commanders, and regular collaborations, there is truly no lack of content. World of Warships Legends is the strategic gameplay of warships you know, now with the comfortability of home console. So why not join in and fight on the seas? Play World of Warships Legends today. Say somehow, for some reason, President-elect Abraham Lincoln never makes it to his inauguration. What if Lincoln got shot earlier?
But Cody, I thought you were gonna do a video about if Lincoln was never shot.
Yeah, Jimmy. I was gonna, but then I went down this rabbit hole and it spiraled from there. And look, This idea is a lot more interesting, alright? Everyone's done a Lincoln never gets assassinated video, including me. What if Lincoln was never assassinated? But has anyone dared kill Lincoln before he was president? Well, I am. Don't take that out of context. Alright, so in this alternate timeline, Lincoln gets killed before he's president. In kind of a f***ed up sense, problem solved, right? Like, the South seceded because Lincoln was elected. If he was dead, then maybe the war just doesn't happen, right? Haha. So, remember what I said earlier. Before Lincoln was even inaugurated, by late February, all 7 states of the Deep South were already gone. They wouldn't just come back because the guy they didn't like died. Plus, from their perspective, Lincoln the person wasn't the sole reason for secession. For the South, Lincoln was just the final straw. Some sort of conflict is going to happen no matter what. It's just now Lincoln isn't there to see the Union through it. He doesn't become the president that's slapped on literally everything. Instead, in this alternate timeline, the US gets his VP, Hannibal Hamlin. Good luck. Man, just imagine that. The country's already in the midst of this absolute chaos, and on top of that, the president-elect is killed. President-elect dead is plastered on every northern newspaper. Lincoln slain. Stuff like that. Hamlin finds himself now at the center of a house fire he did not start. And at least for now, in February, he's not even in charge. President James Buchanan still is. At least, legally. His cabinet at the time would be raiding federal military supplies. His term ends March 4th. Get as much as you can. Because Buchanan is still here, the federal government's response to the first presidential assassination in US history is just a collective shrug. By this point, there isn't much anyone can do. The idea of a smooth transition is tossed out the window. In many ways, the start of the conflict isn't seen as Fort Sumter, it's the death of Lincoln. It's funny how Lincoln was one of the most famous US presidents, debatably the most famous, and yet nobody remembers his VP. Who was Hannibal Hamlin? He was only here to balance the presidential ticket in the first place. Lincoln was from Illinois, a western state, at the time, and the Republican Party needed a New Englander to appeal to the strong anti-slavery base in the region, as well as to be a draw-in for Democrats. Hamlin hated Washington like a cat hates water. Throughout his first term in our timeline, he spent more time in Maine than at his desk. By 1864, the party replaced him with Andrew Johnson, which worked out for everyone. In this alternate timeline, Hamlin, the most VP man to ever VP, now has to be an actual leader. He now has true power, but in the way a chimp behind the wheel of a semi has power. Hamlin was just not equipped to be president, even in peacetime. He wasn't even a candidate during the 1860 Republican Convention, and now he would need to take on a task that withered away Abraham Lincoln. His decisions would decide the fate of the nation. It's just too bad he's literally the worst possible choice at the worst possible time. Well, I guess he's not the actual worst possible choice. You see, back in 1861, VP succession rule was not really set in law. It was more of a guideline, a constitutional suggestion box rather than anything set in stone. When William Henry Harrison kicked the bucket in 1841 after 32 days, the only reason his VP John Tyler took his place was because he basically said, "I'm the president now," and Congress went along with it because someone had to be. This little succession thing didn't become certified until the 25th Amendment in 1967. So Hamlin becoming the next president isn't a done deal at all. But wait, here's the kicker. Lincoln wasn't even sworn in yet. He was shot before taking office. So who takes Buchanan's place? Well, that's where we break out the 1792 Succession Act, meaning that the next in line is Senate President pro tempore John C. Breckinridge, a Kentucky Democrat, the man who won most of the states in the South. In our timeline, he very quickly joined the Confederacy. This might be an issue. Where do we truly go from here? Like really? Breckinridge. Holding a new election? With state militias already taking weapons and ammo from federal stockpiles? Good luck. Elections are about preventing that sort of thing. Can't really stop them when it's already in action. Okay, so say Breckinridge takes office. Well, I have a feeling he wouldn't be in office for too long, nor would the remaining northern states and Washington go along with it. Let's address the elephant in the room here. Southern sympathizers just murdered the president-elect. And that is something that just never happened before, by the way. It was a big deal when Lincoln was shot, and that was after the war. The North nuked the South, and yeah, symbolically Lincoln getting shot sucked, but since they still won this long war, it was really just one last slap from the South. But here, Lincoln's death isn't the war's conclusion, it's the war's start, the lightning rod for the North, and also the signifier of a far more chaotic Civil War. The American Civil War in our timeline was about as formal as a civil war could actually be, the closest you will ever get to red versus blue. For the most part, geography determined sides, and that made things politically simpler for both as well. Most civil wars are, well, everywhere. The government itself is purged or gutted as factions form or leave, and in this alternate timeline, the US in some part gets a taste of that confusion. Because in like 4 different ways, democracy here has failed. In this chaos, Congress needs to make a fateful decision, as the South still begins to mobilize and the North is frozen. They need to figure out who the hell the president is. I'm going to predict that they give the presidency to the man who came in second at the Republican convention. A man who wanted the job so badly, he actually schemed to replace Lincoln in 1864. In the middle of the war. Enter President William H. Seward. Seward is kind of fascinating. Today, if you know anything about him at all, it's that he was stabbed in an assassination plot and he bought Alaska from the Russians. But before the Civil War, he was really Lincoln's biggest rival in the Republican Party. Granted, during the Civil War he kinda was too. He had his own loyal supporters who were crushed when Lincoln won. Which, if you know modern politics, just because a candidate loses, it doesn't mean their influence is gone. Lincoln knew this, and made Seward Secretary of State. When it came to policy, Seward followed the line that Lincoln set. They rarely clashed that much on policy. So, at first glance, imagining a Seward presidency doesn't seem too different at all. You know, at first glance. Seward in the presidential chair would have been very interesting, especially in such a delicate time like the opening days of the war. We know he probably would have called up more volunteers than Lincoln, wanting 100,000 men instead of 70,000. We know that he would have taken the same initial diplomatic approach at keeping the South within the Union, and we know that he wanted to start a war against a European country. Wait, what? Yeah, so Seward was kind of a wacky guy when it came to foreign policy. Or at least, he was a wacky guy, and the best evidence we have for that wackiness was when he channeled it into his job, which was being Secretary of State. December 20th, 1860. During dinner, Seward mused that if the Lord would only give the United States an excuse for war with England, France, or Spain, that would be the best means of re-establishing internal peace. January 29th, 1861. During a private chat with Rudolf Schleiden, Seward once again brings up the idea that a quick war with a foreign power would rally everyone around a common cause. April 1st, 1861. Seward suggests in a memo to Lincoln that the US demand explanation from Spain and France, and if unsatisfied, declare war against them. You get the idea. That was just in the first 4 months. Later on in the year, there was the Trent Affair, where the US seized a British ship to capture some Confederate envoys, a move that Seward supported before backing down. Now, I don't want to make any assumptions on his character, but maybe Seward wouldn't be the calmest hand in this alternate situation. Am I saying he just randomly declares war on the fucking French to stop the Civil War from happening, and then the South still leaves, and so the North is fighting a two-front war? I mean, that would be very funny, but that's an idea that's just so comedic, I have to imagine, sincerely, that somebody would probably have talked him out of this. Just imagine, though, Napoleon III of France and Seward of the Union fighting it out while the South just kinda stands there confused. I'm going to just take this information and make the assumption that Seward as president would be kind of different than Seward as Secretary of State. To sum things up, the absence of Lincoln's hand is very much felt here. He is dead. Seward is the one left to steer the ship, and his political fuel will be Lincoln's death. In our timeline, Fort Sumter was the rallying cry for the North that saw thousands of men volunteer. Yet, even before any shots were truly fired, I could imagine many volunteering solely in response to such an assassination. Lincoln, while disliked by some, would be seen as a martyr for the North. At the same time, federal property would be taken throughout the South, leading to a Fort Sumter situation again, just like in our timeline. How long they would hold out, though, is a different story. There's a wildcard factor here that really comes into play with Seward. He could perhaps maintain that course Lincoln originally set, wait for the South to fire the first shot, or he might do what he wanted to do in our timeline, have Fort Sumter evacuate to avoid any bloodshed at all. Now, is there a possibility that Lincoln's death changes all of that? Maybe. Maybe it makes Seward see red and he reacts immediately. Seward did tell John Bigelow that assassination is not an American practice or habit, and one so vicious and so desperate cannot be engraved into our political system. Yet at the same time, I just don't know if I can see it. He wanted to provoke a European war just to keep the North and South together. That doesn't make me think that Seward would be the person to fire the first shot. Maybe if others around him forced him to do so. Wait, what if others did force him to do so? This is one of those situations where there is no evidence because this didn't happen. It's like imagining what would have happened if that event YouTube doesn't like me mentioning didn't happen. We kind of just have imagined vibes to go off of. Lincoln getting shot before the war was a Kennedy-level event in our history. But here, it's the equivalent of Pearl Harbor, a shot that rings out throughout the North. I don't know what specifically would have happened, but I do know that the Overton window is going to shift. Is peaceful reconciliation even considered before the shots at Fort Sumter? Does anyone in the North still hold out hope for peace? Or is Lincoln's death seen as a traitorous sucker punch from which only war is the solution? I can't say. But if I am going to guess, I don't imagine the weeks of holding out hope for a diplomatic solution to Sumter would have still happened here. In a world where there was a first shot and it killed the president, I think more radical opinions would take center stage. The question really is, where would Seward land on this issue? Does he still wish for peace? Or, even if he does, is he simply carried away by forces greater than himself? It's a question that is truly unanswerable, a fork in the road, and a fork in a road that we never went down. So let's imagine that we did go down that path. Mainly because I don't believe Seward would have been as steadfast as Lincoln in the captain's chair. This was a man who wanted to go to war with Britain to stop a civil war. I do not trust his judgment. Judging from writings about him, it seemed like he was kind of a people pleaser, almost duplicit at times. I believe outside voices might sway him, the ones calling for vengeance. And so, I'm going to say that in this alternate scenario, Seward decides to strike first. In this timeline, there's no Fort Sumter standoff, no waiting game. Seward, at the behest of an angered North and his own cabinet, hit the ground sprinting, calling up twice as many volunteers as Lincoln did, all before spring thaws. His special election isn't just seen as controversial, it throws gasoline on the secession crisis. Perhaps some may think the southern states do have a point. They are facing off against a wrongly elected tyrant. The result? Earlier, messier breakaways. Texas and Virginia don't wait for the guns to start firing in April. They're out by March. The middle ground, whatever existed before Lincoln's death, practically evaporates. In the North, you're either Seward's ally or his enemy. Now, under Lincoln, there was mobilization and declaration of martial law, and it was still controversial under him, but he was, after all, the elected president, to the north. By taking office in such an unconventional manner, Seward is seen as an unelected president who refuses to seek out a diplomatic solution, which tips the scales in Kentucky. While it stayed neutral up until September in our timeline, here we might see a chaotic split just like in Virginia. A Confederate Kentucky pops up, encompassing Lexington, western Pennyroyal, and the new capital, Bowling Green, all of which are home to plantations and pro-Breckinridge elites. However, Louisville, northern Kentucky, and the Appalachian East have a ton of German immigrants who are economically dependent on the Ohio River trade. Perhaps there's a de facto border drawn roughly at the Green River, echoing the 61-62 standoff. While not a complete swing for the state in the other direction, this does mean that for a duration of the war, the CSA gets 30% of the state's population. Whether these borders are recognized on the ground is a whole different story. Missouri remains under the Union, but is more fractured than in our timeline. Governor Claiborne Jackson declares for the Confederacy, but German immigrants and St. Louis Unionists, led by Francis Blair, revolt with federal support. The result? Guerrilla warfare on steroids. Last but not least, we got Maryland, the site of Lincoln's murder. Seward would practically glass the separatists from orbit. Baltimore in particular would feel the wrath of persecution, not only because of its proximity to Washington, but because it becomes immortalized as the site where for the first time an American president was shot. While sympathizers were arrested in Baltimore in our timeline, here perhaps Seward and federal authorities go a little bit too far, using the city as an example for general rebellion. For the most part, the battle lines do not change, but internally in the North, things are far different than they were under Lincoln. While not beloved in his time, Lincoln navigated the war in such a way he was able to survive politically. But would Seward react the same way? Would he handle the issue of what the war was about as delicately as Lincoln? What comes of such an immediate attack on Richmond? With what army is Richmond attacked? And who is at its head? Who exactly is leading the Union forces? It certainly wouldn't be McClellan. It's hard to determine who Seward replaces him with. It has to be someone radical, bold, and with a strapping mustache. But there's multiple choices. It's way too early for Grant to be one of them. Fighting Joe Hooker wasn't a high-ranking general yet, but he had the ambition, the charisma, and the aggression the North was looking for. Then you have Brigadier General Nathan Lyon, ruthless, decisive, reckless. But most likely he would be put in charge of bringing Missouri into the fold. Irvin McDowell, John A. Dix, Benjamin Butler, Robert Patterson, even the dark horse Nathaniel P. Banks, who was fiercely loyal. For one reason or another, these are all bad choices. The most likely outcome is that the Union goes with General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was the General-in-Chief of the U.S. Army in 1861, a hero of the Mexican-American War and the mastermind behind the Anaconda Plan. 75 years old and too fat to ride a horse, he would come up with the battle plans while some younger and more reckless commander would lead on the field, leading to a ton of communication problems. When you look at the pick of the litter here, you can't help but be astonished at the contrast between this batch of rotten eggs and what the Confederates had, or the gap between the early Union commanders and later leaders such as Grant, Sherman, Thomas, Sheridan, Hancock, and Meade. In 1861, Grant was at his father's leather shop. Sherman was in Louisiana. Thomas was fighting Comanches in Texas. Sheridan chased hostile tribes in Oregon. Hancock was guarding the Los Angeles frontier, and Captain Meade was building lighthouses in Detroit. Meanwhile, the Confederacy had its dream team ready to roll. Lee, Beauregard, Johnston, and Stonewall Jackson, all present, all battle ready. And now they will have to meet a full frontal assault against the Confederate capital. Oh boy. The Union Navy still reigns supreme, blockades every port, and attempts to strangle the rebels. There is nothing the Southerners can do to stop the takeover of New Orleans either. But picture this, regardless of who you put up against Lee, how much do you think a larger version of the First Battle of Bull Run is gonna go? Lincoln wanted the moral high ground orchestrated by a Fort Sumter attack, giving some time for McClellan to prepare the Green Army. Something which, by the way, he was good at. It was the only thing he was good at. I want you to imagine a battle in the same weight category as Gettysburg, happening close to Richmond in the summer of 1861. The Union wants to bring the South to heel. Seward wants to make a powerful statement which brings legitimacy to his presidency, which is questioned even in the North. They know they have the industry and the men, and they throw everything behind it. They parade the death of the president-elect at the recruitment offices and gamble it all. Richmond is right next door. Secure the enemy capital, right after you take the biggest city and port. It's a good plan. Ambitious, aggressive, arrogant, disastrous. Lee fights for survival and puts on a masterclass, decimating the Union forces. Tens of thousands die, and the Confederates seize at least as many prisoners as they inflict casualties. They capture supplies, artillery, and inflict a mortal blow to the Union's morale. The troops march too deep into enemy territory and have no chance of escape. Unlike Johnson at Bull Run, Lee does not squander the opportunity to chase down his enemy. A month or two later, the battle cry attracts fresh new recruits, armed with the weapons and artillery Lee just captured. Now the ball is in Confederate hands, and Davis does not hesitate. Lee receives the orders to march directly to Washington. No delay, no blockade, no giving the enemy a chance to recover. This is it. Considering all the given elements and personalities, which we know in great detail, this is the only available option. And maybe, in 1 out of 100 timelines, the Union miraculously defeats Lee's attack, but the rest of the 99 times, Washington and Congress are either captured or evacuated. This isn't just a military victory for the South. This is a lethal blow to the legitimacy of the standing president. Lincoln's death might have united the squabbling factions in this Hail Mary attack, but let's not forget how hard it was for even him to pass the 13th Amendment. Radical Republicans under Thaddeus Stevens, moderate Republicans like Trumbull, war Democrats like Andrew Johnson who were pro-Union but anti-abolition, Copperheads like Vallandigham who wanted immediate peace, as well as conservative Unionists like John J. Crittenden, who may even defect early on. It also just so happens that Seward in our timeline was willing to make a lot of compromises with his beliefs. Initially, he opposed the Emancipation Proclamation, flip-flopped on civil liberties, and was in favor of censorship. This is the guy who said that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, and saw wartime repression as necessary. With the fall of Washington, replacing him would be a really dumb idea, but at the same time, he would take the blame for this colossal failure, and should he remain in power, Congress, now meeting in Philadelphia, would be completely fractured. By the time a response could be organized, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Maryland are all overrun by Confederate forces. At the end of 1861, the writing is on the wall. The only reasonable Southern victory, with even a chance to become a lasting one, was always for an early advance against the North, which is why all the PODs which focus on altering events in 1862 or 1863, or even Gettysburg, kinda make no sense. Don't even get me started on the whole Trent Affair. Here, in late 1861, Britain steps in as mediator to both sides, entering negotiations. The United States of America is broken, and the lines are about to be redrawn. The House is no longer divided against itself as it crumbles. Okay, so a big reason why the Trent Affair, or any sort of POD where Europe gets involved, is impossible, is due to the events in Europe at the time. The American Civil War just happened to occur right around when Bismarck was making his master moves on the chessboard. This is when the whole continent was in a panic. That being said, we know a lot about how the British and French felt about the Civil War at the time, and boy were they interested. People often mention how the British were so reliant on southern cotton, but not only could they supply themselves with cotton from Egypt and India, they were far more reliant on northern corn. What surprised me the most here was the memoirs written by Britain's Prime Minister. Palmerston was a professed opponent of slavery, but he held a lifelong hostility towards the United States. He believed a dissolution of the Union would enhance British power. Additionally, the Confederacy would afford a valuable and extensive market for British manufacturers. Palmerston also ordered reinforcements to be sent to Canada, since he thought that the North would peace out with the South and make up for the lost land by invading Canada. I mean, that's just silly and unrealistic. Why would any American president even want to invade Canada? But hey, look at the time, Jimmy. As much as I hate to do this, I have to end it here. I know. I also want to know what the new partitioned America would look like. How far do the Southern demands go? Do they go as far as to include Delaware? What about California? What about their plans to invade Mexico and form the Golden Circle? Confederate agents were sent into Mexico to foment revolt, which would be later followed up by military action. What about France? Spanish Cuba? The mission to Japan? How long does the South still cling on to slavery, considering that it was supposedly already out the door? Does it adapt to the changing world with British and French investment, or does industrialization just create a new beast? Who does the North elect as their new president? What happens with all the great generals who never got to see action? Do they prepare for round 2? Do we get to see Brigham Young declare the theocratic Mormon kingdom in Utah supported by the CSA? I don't know. Sounds like this could be a sequel or something. Anyway, this is Cody of Alternate History Hub.